Everyone thought it was just a regular orange waste dump. But 30 years later, what an environmentalist saw shocked the whole world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching from. She had dreamed of this place long before she ever set foot on the hot soil of Costa Rica. For years, she had studied textbooks filled with grainy photographs of tropical forests with their endless green canopies and rivers of astonishing clarity. As a child, growing up on a small Caribbean island, she had pressed her forehead against the school window while her teachers spoke of deforestation and the fragility of rainforest, imagining herself among those distant giants of wood and leaf. Her mother used to tell her stories of the birds that once filled their skies in flocks so dense that day turned to dusk when they passed. By the time she reached adolescence, those birds were nearly gone, and the woods she had wandered as a child were carved away to make room for sugarcane fields. That wound was the seed of her calling. She decided she would dedicate her life to protecting what remained of the natural world. Years later, after enduring the rigor of university life where her skin color, accent, and gender often set her apart, she emerged stronger. She earned scholarships through sheer determination, and though her path was not without loneliness, she carried with her an unwavering belief that science and love for the earth could not be defeated. When the chance arose to travel to Costa Rica and assist in one of the most ambitious ecological programs of the late 20th century, she felt as though the arc of her life had finally curved toward destiny. She packed her modest belongings, kissed her mother's lined face, and boarded a plane that hummed with promise. The first days in Costa Rica were a dream realized. She stood at the edge of dense forest where the air pulsed with cicadas, and howler monkeys bellowed from the distance like drums echoing through a cathedral. Vines curled around towering ceiba trees, orchids blossomed from mossy branches, and iridescent butterflies floated like living jewels. The smells overwhelmed her. Damp soil, flowers thick with perfume, the sharp tang of resin and sap. She thought she had entered a sanctuary untouched by human hands, a place that would forever resist the heavy boots of industry. Yet, her guides quickly reminded her that even here, in this celebrated park, scars of exploitation lay just beyond the wall of trees. They led her past the dense greenery and into a landscape that felt like stepping through a veil into another world. The shade of the forest dissolved, and she was suddenly blinded by the raw, relentless sun. Beneath her feet, the earth had hardened into a brittle crust, pale and cracked like old bone. Once, long ago, this had been pasture for cattle. Before that, it had been forest as alive as the one she had just walked through. Now, it was nothing but exhaustion. Grass struggled to survive, its blades thin and yellowed. The few scattered shrubs looked like ghosts of plants, gray and lifeless. The air was still, not a bird to be heard, as if even the wind had abandoned this place. She crouched to touch the ground. It was hot and unyielding beneath her fingertips, a surface compacted by years of hooves and sun. The soil gave nothing back, no coolness, no sense of hidden life. It was as if she had pressed her hand against a tomb. Her heart sank. In the book she had read as a girl, restoration seemed like a matter of planting seeds and waiting. But here she saw what no book had ever truly conveyed, a place so broken it resisted the very idea of rebirth. As the days passed, she learned the history of these pastures. The farmers had cleared the forests decades earlier, chasing the promise of profit from cattle ranching. For a time, the grass grew thick, and herds grazed under the relentless sky. But tropical soils were thin, and the grass, cropped too close by hungry mouths, never recovered. Year by year, the land lost strength until the ranchers abandoned it, leaving behind a desert masquerading as a field. The government eventually absorbed the ruined parcels into the expanding national park, but no one knew what to do with them. They lay like scars across the landscape, reminders of how quickly abundance could turn to emptiness. The young ecologist walked these fields each day, taking notes, measuring soil, documenting the poverty of life. At night, she sat with other researchers, eating rice and beans by lantern light, listening to the calls of frogs that still clung to wetter areas of the park. Around her were men and women who shared her passion, who spoke of corridors for jaguars and the recovery of rare trees. Their eyes burned with conviction. Yet, when talk turned to the barren pastures, the room always grew quiet. Everyone knew how much it would cost to bring them back. Millions of seedlings, endless irrigation, decades of care. It was a price few nations, even prosperous ones, could afford. She felt both inspired and disheartened, inspired by the possibility of working among such dedicated minds in such a wondrous land, but disheartened by the reality that even they could not envision a solution. Each evening, when she returned to her tent, she lay awake listening to the rustle of the forest beyond and staring at the emptiness in her notes. For the first time in her young career, doubt crept into her chest. Was her dream naive? Could a single person, even a community of scientists, really fight back against destruction that seemed to swallow the world whole? One afternoon, standing on a ridge overlooking both the forest and the desolate fields, she felt the weight of that doubt pressing harder than ever. To her left stretched endless green. To her right, a graveyard of earth. She saw in the contrast the struggle of her own life. She carried the legacy of her island's vanishing forests within her, and now she saw the same wounds carved into this foreign land. The question gnawed at her. Was she destined to spend her life documenting loss rather than nurturing renewal? And yet, even in her despair, she felt a strange whisper of possibility. Perhaps somewhere, hidden in the folds of the earth, seeds still waited. Perhaps under the crust lay a memory of fertility that time could coax back to life. She had no evidence, only intuition. But as she turned away from the ridge, the sight of a lone sprout forcing its way through a crack in the soil caught her eye. It was small, fragile, almost absurd in its defiance. She lingered on it, the image searing itself into her thoughts. That night, as she wrote in her journal, she described the sprout not as evidence of recovery, but as a question the land was asking her. What will you do to help? She did not yet know the answer, but she felt certain she could not simply walk away. Something had to be tried, something new, something that might seem impossible. It was the beginning of an idea she could not yet articulate, but which would soon reveal itself in the most unlikely of ways. The days continued, filled with sweat, endless sun, and the hum of insects. She learned to live with disappointment, yet also with the small miracles of resilience hidden in corners of the park. The laughter of her colleagues, the kindness of villagers who offered mangoes and stories, the shimmer of fireflies above her tent at night, all reminded her that life had a way of pushing forward, no matter how deep the wound. She carried those reminders like talismans, though they did not erase the grim image of the barren pastures. When news came that a company had offered to collaborate with the park in a strange new experiment, she listened with curiosity, but also suspicion. She was too young then to grasp the scale of what was about to unfold, too bound by the immediacy of sights and smells to imagine the long arc of time. For now, she simply walked each morning across the brittle earth, taking in the silence, breathing in the emptiness, and carrying in her chest a fragile hope that something, anything, might yet be possible. It was here, in these ashes of the past, that her story began. She could not know that decades later, the very ground she now condemned as lifeless would rise again in a transformation so complete it would feel like witnessing resurrection. But in those early years, she knew only the weight of ruin, the sting of doubt, and the longing to believe that nature was stronger than despair. The months that followed seemed to pass in a rhythm of repetition. Each day she rose with the sun, her hair damp with the night's humidity, her notebooks filled with careful but increasingly monotonous observations of soil too dry to nourish a seed. It was a life of waiting, a limbo between hope and resignation, until one morning word spread through the camp of a plan so strange that it left everyone speaking in whispers. The park authorities had struck an agreement with a newly established juice company. Instead of paying the steep costs of transporting and processing their mountain of waste, the company would be permitted to unload tons of orange peels and pulp onto the exhausted pastures of the park. The idea, pitched by a pair of well-known ecologists, was as bold as it was absurd. Let waste heal what years of care could not. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. The images in her mind did not match the words. She had come to the park to heal forests, not to turn it into a dumping ground. Yet, within days, the rumble of diesel engines filled the morning air. Down the dirt roads rolled convoys of trucks, their tires coated with dust, their metal sides painted with images of smiling suns and orange halves bursting with juice. She stood at the edge of the field and watched the first truck raise its bed, tipping a cascade of golden rinds that tumbled onto the ground with a wet slap. Another truck followed, and another, until the pasture she had once walked with despair began to disappear beneath a rising tide of citrus waste. The sight was overwhelming. The sun reflected off the peels so that the land seemed aflame, as if the pasture had been draped in molten gold. The air, once still with dust, filled with the overpowering scent of oranges, sweet and acrid at once, intoxicating and nauseating. Flies materialized almost instantly, drawn in black clouds that hovered and descended, a living shroud that seemed to ripple and breathe. The smell grew stronger by the hour as the heaps warmed, the sugars fermenting, sending waves of tang through the valley. She covered her nose with a cloth, yet the odor pierced through, clinging to her hair, her clothes, even her dreams when she tried to sleep at night. The first week was chaos. Birds descended in raucous swarms, feasting on the pulp. Raccoons and coatis ventured closer than ever before, their paws stained sticky with juice. Villagers from nearby communities came to the edge of the park, their faces twisted with suspicion. They shouted questions and accusations. Was the park now nothing more than a landfill? Would their streams be poisoned by this madness? Children gagged from the stench that carried on the wind, and mothers scolded the rangers for allowing such filth within sacred boundaries. In the evenings, debates raged among the scientists. Some argued with excitement, insisting that the infusion of organic matter could be the very thing the soil needed to loosen its grip to breathe again. Others shook their heads in disbelief, warning that acidity from the citrus could sterilize what little life remained beneath the crust. She sat among them, listening, her heart torn. By daylight, she had witnessed the grotesque spectacle of decay. By lantern light, she heard visions of rebirth. Between the two, she swayed like a leaf caught in opposing winds. Weeks turned into months. The piles grew higher. thousands of truckloads spreading across the pasture until the once barren land became a quilt of uneven mounds. From above, it must have looked as if a giant hand had smeared ochre paint across the earth. She recorded the process diligently, her journals stained with juice, her sketches filled with shifting topographies of waste. She wrote of the way the peels began to darken, the once bright orange fading into brown, curling at the edges, collapsing inward as rot consumed them. She wrote of the steam rising at dawn, the way the land seemed to breathe under its blanket of fruit. But she also wrote of the discontent beyond the research camp. In town, newspapers printed headlines warning of catastrophe. Editorials accused the park of betrayal, turning conservation into collusion with industry. Radio hosts mocked the project as nothing more than a company's clever trick to dump waste under the guise of science. At the center of the storm was not only the stench or the flies, but the rivalry between corporations. The competitor of the juice company fanned the flames, filing lawsuits, declaring that the park had been defiled, that laws had been trampled. In courtrooms far from the fields she walked each day, men in suits argued about contamination and corruption, while the true story rotted quietly under the sun. She could not ignore the shift in the camp itself. Where once laughter carried through the night, now silence lingered. Scientists who had championed the experiment grew weary under the glare of public scrutiny. Some distanced themselves, muttering that they had never truly supported the plan. Others dug in deeper, their conviction sharpened by opposition, though their eyes betrayed exhaustion. She herself felt adrift, caught between the exhilaration of a daring vision and the undeniable ugliness of its execution. One afternoon, she wandered alone to the center of the dumping ground. The air was thick, her boots sinking slightly into the fermenting mass. Around her stretched an alien landscape, a wasteland painted in shades of orange and brown, buzzing with insects. She crouched low, pressing her hand into the layers. Beneath the topmost rot, the peels were warm, softening, beginning to dissolve into something almost soil-like. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed the outline of possibility, the faintest promise that beneath the chaos lay transformation. But when she rose and looked again across the endless heaps, the vision dissolved into despair. How could such grotesque abundance lead to life? The months bled together, and the legal battle reached its conclusion. News arrived one hot morning as she was cataloging the latest measurements of pH levels. The court had ruled against the project. The company was ordered to stop immediately. No more trucks would arrive. No more mountains of peel would grow. What had begun as an audacious experiment ended abruptly, not with triumph, but with silence. The fields, half buried in rotten fruit, were abandoned to time. That evening, the camp gathered in uneasy quiet. Some cursed the decision, others muttered relief. For her, the ruling felt like a personal blow. She thought of the sprout she had once seen forcing its way through cracked soil, the question it had asked her. Now, it seemed the answer was clear. Failure. The vision of renewal, the chance to see life return through strange and humble means, had been smothered by the stench of politics and mistrust. She closed her notebook with trembling hands, certain she would never again walk these fields with hope. The next day, she left the site, carrying with her the memory of golden heaps shimmering under the pitiless sun, the chorus of flies, the sour air that clung to her skin. In her mind, it was not a place of beginnings, but of endings. She told herself she would move on, that her work would take her to other lands, other struggles. Yet, deep within her, the image of that pasture refused to fade. It lodged in her chest like a stone, heavy and unresolved. She did not yet know that decades later she would return, and that the very ground she had condemned as wasted would rise to meet her in ways she could not have dreamed. But for now, as she boarded the bus that carried her away from the park, she carried only disappointment, believing she had witnessed nothing more than a grand and embarrassing failure. The bus that carried her away from the park rattled over uneven roads, its windows streaked with dust, the air inside heavy with the scent of gasoline. She pressed her forehead against the glass and tried not to think of the mountains of rotting citrus she had left behind. Yet the images refused to release her. The shimmering heaps of orange, the clouds of flies, the acrid sweetness that clung to her nostrils, all replayed in her mind with the vividness of a nightmare. As the landscape rolled past, lush hills giving way to small towns, and then to the sprawling outskirts of the capital, she felt a hollowness take root in her chest. What she had witnessed had not been a triumph of ecological vision, as some had hoped, but a public spectacle that ended in bitterness and defeat. She was too young then to understand how failures could sometimes disguise their opposite. All she knew was the taste of disillusionment. Her career, however, did not end with that bus ride. If anything, it accelerated. The world in the closing years of the 20th century was awakening to the enormity of its environmental crises, and voices like hers were suddenly in demand. She moved from project to project, country to country, carrying her notebooks and her questions, lending her skills to teams that sought to rescue rivers, restore wetlands, and protect dwindling forests. She worked under the blazing sun of Africa, where acacia trees stood alone like sentinels over parched savannas, their shadows barely wide enough to cover her. She walked through villages in South Asia, where children played along rivers choked with plastic and foam, their laughter clashing with the smell of decay. She traveled deep into the Amazon, where chainsaws whined in the distance and smoke from burning clearings blurred the horizon. Everywhere she went, she found the same pattern. Ambition had stripped the land bare, and the struggle to heal it seemed insurmountable. Despite the urgency of her work, a shadow followed her. In quiet moments, when she sat by herself on the wooden porches of field stations or in the dim corners of airports, her thoughts drifted back to Costa Rica. She would remember the court's decision, the way her colleagues had packed their instruments in silence, the bitter taste of defeat in their voices. She remembered the villagers' anger, the headlines calling the project a disgrace. But most of all, she remembered the fields themselves, that quilt of fermenting gold, slowly collapsing into a soggy brown mass. In her memory, it always smelled of rot, always hummed with flies, always represented the futility of daring to hope too boldly. She tried to bury the memory under layers of work and travel, but it clung stubbornly. At night, when exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep, she would sometimes dream of those fields. In one dream, the heaps grew higher and higher until they blocked out the sky, and she was buried beneath them, gasping for air. In another, she walked across the cracked earth, only to see sprouts pushing through the peel, reaching for her with fragile leaves. She would wake with her heart racing, the image of those sprouts lingering like a question she could never quite answer. Were they real, or merely figments of her desperate hope? She could no longer be sure. The years added weight to her shoulders. She earned recognition, even awards. Articles carried her name, panels invited her voice, and her face appeared in photographs beside diplomats and activists. Outwardly, she was the embodiment of success. Inwardly, she carried a gnawing sense of incompleteness. No matter how many projects she joined, no matter how many forests she tried to protect, she could not shake the feeling that she had abandoned something unresolved in Costa Rica. The orange experiment had ended in scandal, but what haunted her was not the disgrace. It was the silence that followed, the way the world had simply moved on, as if that land no longer mattered. One afternoon, while working in a Southeast Asian mangrove reserve, she watched children planting seedlings along the shore. Their bare feet sank into mud as they pressed the young shoots into place. The sun burned hot above, but their laughter rose in bright defiance of the heat. She smiled, but as she turned away, the memory of Costa Rica returned unbidden. She imagined those children not by the sea, but on the barren pastures of Guanacaste, their hands clutching orange peels instead of seedlings. The vision unsettled her. She shook it off and returned to her tasks, yet the thought followed her like a shadow. As the years stretched into decades, her sense of disquiet deepened. She began to notice that whenever she spoke publicly, whenever she addressed audiences about restoration and resilience, her words faltered when she thought of that failed experiment. She would pause, searching for the right phrasing, skirting around the memory as if it were a stone in her shoe. Her listeners never noticed, but she did. She knew she had not made peace with it. She could not. By the time 30 years had passed, she had become a seasoned voice in her field, her hair streaked with silver, her hands lined with the marks of travel and toil. Yet the questions that had haunted her youth still whispered at the edges of her mind. What had become of that land? Had the orange heaps simply vanished into the soil, leaving behind nothing but a sour memory? Or had something else occurred, hidden from the eyes of the world? Each time she asked herself, she felt the same tug in her chest, as though the land itself were calling her back. She began to imagine the field as if it were a person, left behind and forgotten, waiting for her return. In her mind's eye, she saw it stretching beneath the unforgiving sun, a patient witness to the passage of time. She told herself that it was foolishness, a projection born of guilt. Yet the feeling grew stronger until she could no longer dismiss it. She realized she had spent her life wandering, but she had never truly moved beyond that one place. It remained lodged within her, a knot in her story, a question without an answer. And so, late one evening, as she sat by a window in her apartment, overlooking a city humming with traffic, she made a decision. The time had come to return. She would go back to Costa Rica, back to the park, back to the field that had haunted her for so long. She did not know what she would find, whether only dust and disappointment or something more. But she knew she could not continue her journey until she faced it once more. She had wandered the world for decades, but her path had always curved toward this moment. The time for wandering was ending. The time for returning had begun. The decision to return to Costa Rica did not come to her in a sudden rush, but as a slow gathering storm. It had been forming inside her for years, hidden beneath layers of work and duty, until at last it broke through the surface with such clarity that she could not resist it. By then, she was no longer the young woman who had once stood in the fields of Guanacaste, bewildered by mountains of fermenting orange peels. Her face had changed, marked by years of travel, her eyes lined with the weight of seeing too much ruin and too little renewal. Yet, within her, the same unquiet ember still glowed. She could not let her story end without returning to the beginning. Arriving once more in Costa Rica after 30 years was a disorienting experience. The airport had grown larger, the roads more crowded with traffic, the cities spreading their arms wider across the hills. She felt like a ghost slipping into a world that had kept moving without her. When she spoke to the younger ecologists she met in the capital, they listened politely but without recognition. To them, she was a veteran, someone who had lived through an era already fading into history. Few of them had even heard of the orange peel experiment. To her, it was a wound that had never healed, but to them it was nothing more than a forgotten footnote in a dusty report. She left the city quickly, unwilling to waste time. The closer she drew to the park, the more a strange nervousness coiled in her chest. What if she found nothing? What if the field was exactly as she remembered? Dead, barren, silent. Or worse, what if the land had been swallowed by another project, paved over, erased entirely? She tried to steady her thoughts, reminding herself that whatever she found, it would at least be truth, and truth was better than endless wondering. The journey into the park was far more difficult than she expected. The roads she remembered were gone or overgrown, replaced by new paths that twisted unpredictably. Guides offered to take her to the places most visitors wanted to see: lush forests alive with birds, waterfalls that spilled like silver ribbons, volcanic ridges crowned with mist. But when she asked about the degraded pastures, about forgotten clearings where nothing had grown, their faces went blank. Some shook their heads as if she were speaking of a myth. Others looked away, uncomfortable, as though she were asking them to recall a shame they preferred to leave buried. Undeterred, she pressed on alone, armed with old maps and fragments of memory. She recognized certain landmarks, the bend of a river, the shape of a ridge against the sky, but much of the landscape seemed unrecognizable. 30 years had not stood still. Fields she had once walked were hidden now beneath thickets of grass and clusters of secondary trees. The park itself felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a childhood home where every room had been rearranged. For days she searched. Each morning she set out with determination, her pack heavy with water and notebooks, her clothes soaked in sweat before noon. The sun was relentless, and insects buzzed in clouds that clung to her skin. She climbed rocky outcrops, scanning the horizon for signs of the place she sought, only to descend into valleys that led nowhere. At night, she returned to camp exhausted, her body aching, her spirit fraying. Yet each dawn she rose again, driven by something stronger than fatigue. On the 5th day, she thought she had found it. She stumbled upon a clearing that matched her memory, flat, open, the soil cracked and bare. Her heart quickened as she stood there, the silence pressing around her. But when she walked the ground more carefully, she realized it was not the same. There were no traces of citrus, no subtle depressions where trucks might have dumped their loads. It was simply another scar among many. The disappointment struck her like a blow. She sat on the dry earth until the sun sank, feeling foolish for chasing a ghost. Still, she could not give up. On the 7th day, she rose earlier than usual, before the sky had turned fully light, and followed a faint animal trail into a part of the park she did not remember. The path twisted through thorny brush and then opened suddenly into a space that stole her breath. It was not barren. It was not scarred. It was something else entirely. Before her stretched a wall of green so dense it seemed impenetrable. Trees rose tall and proud, their trunks thick with age, their crowns entwined in a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting light. Vines hung like serpents, flowers bloomed in bursts of color, and the air was alive with the calls of birds. She froze where she stood, confusion battling disbelief. This was not what she had come looking for. This was not what she had expected to find. Yet something in the shape of the land tugged at her memory. Slowly, carefully, she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed deeper into the forest, she realized the truth. The ridges, the slope of the ground, the distant outline of the hills, it all matched. This was the place. This was the very field she had once walked, the place where trucks had emptied their mountains of fruit, where the air had been thick with stench and buzzing flies. She stopped and turned slowly in a circle, trying to align the memory of orange heaps with the reality before her. The contrast was so complete it felt like standing in two worlds at once. A strange emotion surged through her, a mixture of awe and confusion, tinged with fear. Had she been mistaken? Was this truly the same land? She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. It yielded easily, dark and moist, alive with the smell of fertility. No trace of the brittle crust she remembered. She looked around her at the towering trees, the dense undergrowth, the flitting shapes of insects and birds. Life pulsed in every direction. Tears blurred her vision. She remembered the day she had walked away, convinced the experiment had ended in disgrace, certain the land would remain a monument to folly. Yet here it was, unrecognizable, transformed. The silence of death had become a chorus of renewal. She sank to the ground, overcome, the forest humming around her like a vast and patient truth finally revealed. She did not yet understand how it had happened, what alchemy of time and decay had conjured this rebirth. All she knew was that she was standing in the middle of a miracle. The wandering years had carried her across continents, but they had always been leading her back here, to this revelation. She had sought closure, but what she found was something greater, a new beginning. She remained on the forest floor for what felt like hours, her knees pressed into the damp earth, her palms open on the soil that had once resisted her touch with brittle indifference. Now it welcomed her, yielding softly beneath her fingers, exhaling the scent of fertility that seemed to rise from the very bones of the land. Around her, the forest continued to move, alive in every sense, a world that no longer carried the silence of ruin but the music of abundance. She closed her eyes and tried to reconcile the images that flickered in her mind. The endless mounds of rotting orange peels, the buzzing veil of flies, the villagers' shouts of protest, the court's ruling that had ended it all in shame. She had carried that memory like a scar across decades. But now she was confronted with something entirely different. This place, once a graveyard, was now a sanctuary. She rose slowly and walked deeper into the trees. The light fell in shifting mosaics through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with patches of brightness that danced with every movement of the leaves. Vines twisted upward like ropes, flowers blazed in sudden bursts of red and yellow, and the air was thick with the hum of insects. Birds darted across her path, their wings flashing in the dim light, their calls echoing against the trees with notes of defiance and joy. Every step she took seemed to contradict the memories she had held for 30 years. This was not the land she had abandoned. This was a new land altogether, one reborn without her noticing, without anyone noticing. She tried to orient herself, recalling where the trucks had once stood, where the heaps had sprawled across the pasture. She remembered the ridge where she had often paused to take notes, the angle of the slope that had made the runoff flow like a shallow stream during heavy rains. Slowly, she pieced the landmarks together. It was undeniable. This was the very same place. What she was seeing was not an illusion, not a trick of memory. The barren earth she had mourned had become forest. Her throat tightened as she pushed through the undergrowth, her boots sinking into soil that clung with richness. She paused by a tree whose trunk would have taken her both arms to encircle. She leaned against it, resting her cheek against the bark, feeling its solidity, its weight, its testimony to time. She tried to imagine how the seeds had found their way here, how they had rooted and reached upward. Perhaps they had lain dormant in the soil for years, waiting for release. Perhaps animals had carried them in, drawn by the strange feast of fruit that had once covered the ground. Perhaps the peels themselves, in rotting, had called forth the conditions for life to awaken. The exact chain of events no longer mattered. What mattered was what she saw before her, renewal beyond her wildest hope. As she wandered, she noticed how the layers of life intertwined. Saplings crowded in the shadows of taller trees, competing for their share of sunlight. Lianas coiled upward like muscular serpents, draping the trunks in living ropes. Ferns spread in wide fans across the damp floor, their fronds trembling with each step she took. Insects, tiny architects of decay, moved busily among fallen leaves, and butterflies flashed their colors as if the air itself were stitched with fragments of stained glass. In the distance, she caught sight of a family of monkeys leaping through the canopy, their cries carrying like laughter. Every detail shouted the same truth. The land was no longer broken. It was whole. She paused by a small clearing where sunlight fell full upon the ground. There, amid the tangle of undergrowth, she saw the unmistakable remains of orange peel, or what might once have been peel, darkened scraps buried in the soil, so decomposed they crumbled at her touch. She lifted a fragment, fragile as parchment, and held it between her fingers. A laugh escaped her lips, unbidden, mingled with a sob. Here was the last trace of what had once been considered filth, now absorbed into the fabric of the forest. What had seemed like a grotesque failure was in truth the foundation of triumph. Her thoughts returned to that younger version of herself, the woman who had walked away burdened with disappointment, who had boarded the bus believing she had witnessed folly. That woman had not been wrong to feel despair, yet she had been blind to the deeper patience of nature. She realized now how short her vision had been, how quick to judge. 30 years had been a blink to the forest, a single breath in its long life. Time had done what no human plan or budget could have achieved. The orange heaps had not poisoned the land. They had fed it. She sank again to the ground, her back resting against a trunk, her eyes lifted to the canopy. Light sifted down like a benediction. She felt herself small, humbled, yet also renewed. This was not merely an ecological revelation, it was a personal one. For decades she had carried doubt, wondering if her work was ever enough, if hope itself was foolishness. Now she saw proof that hope was not only valid but necessary, even when it seemed absurd. The land had healed itself because someone had dared to give it a chance, even clumsily, even controversially. What she had once called failure was, in fact, the beginning of healing. The hours slipped by as she remained there, walking slowly, touching bark, crouching to examine leaves, listening to the layered symphony of the forest. Each sound, each sight, seemed to draw her deeper into recognition. She thought of all the years she had wandered across continents, of the countless landscapes she had tried to mend, of the speeches and reports and meetings that had filled her days. None of them had prepared her for this moment. None of them could match the power of standing in this resurrected place where silence had been replaced with song. As the day waned and the light softened into evening, she felt a profound calm settle over her. She no longer needed to ask the land what had become of it. The answers surrounded her in every leaf, every bird call, every breath of wind through the canopy. The orange experiment had not ended in disgrace. It had ended here, in a forest that whispered of resilience. She felt tears slide down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of gratitude. The land had carried its own secret for 30 years, and now it had revealed it to her alone. When she finally turned back toward her camp, the shadows stretched long across the ground. The forest moved with her, its life brushing against her arms and ankles, reminding her at every step of the miracle she had witnessed. She carried no sample jars, no photographs, no instruments. What she carried was deeper, etched into her memory, into the marrow of her being. The revelation was hers to bear, hers to share, a truth stronger than doubt. The land she had thought lost was alive again, and in its renewal she too felt reborn. That night she could hardly sleep. In the stillness of her tent, with the thin fabric walls breathing faintly in the breeze, her mind replayed every detail of what she had seen. The forest was not simply a transformation of soil and seed. It was a rebuke to her despair, a reminder that nature did not move according to human calendars or expectations. It demanded patience, and in return it offered resilience that no plan could match. Lying on her cot, she listened to the steady pulse of the forest outside, the shrill calls of insects, the distant rustle of monkeys in the canopy, the faint drip of moisture from leaf to leaf, and she felt herself surrendering to a truth she had resisted for 30 years. The failure she had carried in her memory had never truly been failure at all. It had been the first act of a story whose ending she was only now beginning to witness. In the days that followed, she returned again and again to the site, each visit revealing new details she had missed before. She knelt among the roots of trees that had sprouted after she left, their trunks already wide enough to dwarf her, their crowns reaching high into the sky. She followed the trails of insects as they disappeared into the soil, realizing that it was they who had first dismantled the peels, fragment by fragment, transforming refuse into nourishment. She watched birds alight on branches and carry seeds in their beaks, scattering them across the forest floor as though conspiring with the land itself to hasten recovery. Everywhere she turned, she saw evidence of collaboration, between decay and renewal, between waste and growth, between time and silence. One afternoon, after hours spent wandering beneath the canopy, she paused by a stream that trickled through the area. The water was clear, its banks lined with ferns and moss. She bent down to drink and tasted freshness, where once she had tasted only dust. For years she had thought of this place as a desert. Now she saw it as a wellspring. The realization filled her with a humility so profound it was almost painful. She had always believed in the power of science, of careful planning and deliberate action. But here was proof that sometimes the most profound restoration came not from control but from letting go, from trusting the processes older and wiser than any of us. The discovery reshaped more than her understanding of the land. It reshaped her understanding of herself. She remembered the speeches she had given in international halls, the conferences where she had urged governments to commit more money, more resources, more urgency. She remembered the nights when she had lain awake convinced that humanity could never repair the damage it had done. But here was a piece of earth that had healed without budgets, without policies, without even the approval of the courts that had tried to stop it. The orange heaps once dismissed as waste, had been enough to tilt the balance. They had suffocated the grasses that choked the soil, fed the microbes that rebuilt fertility, and opened the way for seeds to claim the ground. It was so simple, so accidental, so profoundly beyond what anyone had intended. As she walked the forest, she began to imagine how many other forgotten places might hold the same potential. She thought of the fields of her childhood island, stripped for sugarcane and left barren. She thought of the parched savannas she had crossed in Africa, the polluted riverbanks of Asia, the hollowed remains of forests in South America. All those wounds, left to fester, might also contain within them the seeds of recovery, if given even a fraction of what this place had received. It was not a formula to be copied blindly, she knew. Citrus peels might restore one landscape but destroy another. The alchemy of recovery was too complex to be universal. Yet the principle was undeniable. What humanity cast aside as waste could, in the right place and under the right conditions, become the foundation of renewal. She spent long hours with her journal, writing not just observations but reflections. Her words poured across the pages, mingling science with wonder, data with gratitude. She sketched the outlines of trees, recorded the bird calls she learned to distinguish, pressed leaves between pages as if trying to capture the essence of the miracle she had found. But she also wrote about herself, about the younger woman who had walked away ashamed, about the years she had spent doubting, about the revelation that now surged through her like a river. For the first time in decades, she felt not only the weight of her failures, but the gift hidden within them. She understood now that failure was often only a beginning, disguised in rough garments. Sometimes she lingered at the edge of the clearing where she had first realized the truth. She would sit against a trunk, her back warmed by the bark, and let her mind drift. She imagined the field as she had once known it, bare, cracked, suffocating under the sun. Then she overlaid that image with what she saw before her. A cathedral of green, filled with the murmurs and cries of life. The two visions clashed and then merged, reminding her that the present was born of the past, that the rotting heaps she had once despised had been the very doorway through which the forest returned. The change in her heart was as complete as the change in the land. She no longer viewed herself as a witness to despair, but as a participant in a story far larger than she had ever imagined. The forest had taught her that restoration was not always about planting or building, but about trusting and waiting. It had taught her that even waste, even what the world called filth, could carry within it the power of rebirth. And most of all, it had taught her that hope must not be measured by immediate results, but by the long, patient scale of nature itself. As the weeks passed, she felt lighter than she had in years. She no longer dreaded the memories of the experiment. She cherished them. They were the prologue to a miracle, the proof that even in controversy and ridicule there can lie the seed of transformation. She knew now that her life's work had not been in vain. Every speech, every protest, every seedling planted had been a part of a greater conversation with the earth, a conversation that this forest had answered with grace. When, at last, she prepared to leave the site, she did so with reluctance, but also with certainty. She had come in search of closure and had found instead renewal. The years of wandering had brought her full circle, and the circle had revealed its meaning. She walked back through the trees one final time, her hand brushing the trunks as if in farewell, and whispered her thanks into the canopy. She carried nothing with her but the knowledge that the world was more resilient than she had ever dared believe. The revelation was not just about the forest. It was about her, too. She had arrived here burdened by failure, but she would leave carrying new meaning, a new mission. She would no longer speak of despair. She would speak of possibility, of patience, of the astonishing alchemy that could turn waste into wonder. The forest had given her back her faith, and with it, her purpose. When she finally stepped away from the forest, her heart carried the weight of something too vast to be contained in mere notes or samples. It was not the kind of discovery that could be plotted on a graph or reduced to a line in a scientific report. It was a revelation that belonged to both reason and faith, something that had touched her as deeply as any moment in her life. She knew she could not leave it buried in her own memory. The story of this land, the miracle that had unfolded in silence over 3 decades, needed to be told. Her return to the capital was quieter than her arrival. The city bustled with the noise of traffic, markets, and construction, but she moved through it as if insulated by the forest's calm. She carried no photographs, for she had chosen to let her eyes and words do the remembering, but she carried a conviction that burned in her chest like a lantern. When she met with local colleagues, many of them much younger than herself, she began to share what she had seen. At first, they listened with skepticism, but as she described the transformation, the barren pasture reborn as dense forest, the soil renewed, the life returning, she saw their eyes widen. Some scribbled notes as if grasping at every detail, while others simply sat in silence, letting the weight of her words settle in. From there, the story spread. Invitations came for her to speak not only in Costa Rica, but far beyond. Universities asked her to lecture, organizations wanted her testimony, journalists requested interviews. She traveled again, but this time her journey felt different. She was no longer wandering in search of answers. She carried the answer with her, offering it like a seed she could place in the minds of others. In auditoriums filled with students, she spoke of the patience of nature. In crowded halls of policymakers, she urged them to rethink what they called waste. In quiet meetings with local farmers, she explained how even the discards of industry could be transformed into soil and shade, if only given time. Yet, she was careful not to let the story become distorted. She warned against treating it as a simple formula, a solution to be copied blindly. What had happened in Guanacaste was not a miracle that could be manufactured anywhere at will. It depended on the climate, the soil, the ecology of that particular place. But the lesson was universal, that renewal is possible in the most unlikely circumstances, that what we dismiss as ruin may hold the seeds of restoration. Her voice carried both caution and hope, and in that balance people heard truth. For herself, the greatest change was within. She no longer carried the burden of failure she had borne for so long. Instead, she felt a sense of continuity, as though her life's work had been given a new foundation. The years she had spent fighting against despair, the endless journeys across wounded landscapes, the lonely nights of doubt, all of them had prepared her for this message. She had thought she was searching for closure, but what she found was a new beginning. Sometimes, when the lectures ended and the applause faded, she would sit alone in her hotel room and close her eyes. She would imagine the forest again, the way the light filtered through the canopy, the damp smell of fertile soil, the chatter of monkeys in the branches above. She felt connected to it in a way that went beyond geography. It was no longer just a place she had once visited, it was part of her, as inseparable as memory itself. It had given her back her hope, and in return she carried its story to the world. Years passed, and with them came new challenges. The climate crisis deepened. Fires and floods scarred the earth, Species vanished at alarming rates. At times, the tide of bad news threatened to overwhelm even the strongest spirits, but whenever she felt the weight of despair pressing in, she thought of the forest. She remembered that what looked like disaster could, with patience and trust, become renewal. She shared that conviction with all who would listen, and even with those who would not. In her later years, she returned again to Guanacaste, no longer as a researcher but as a pilgrim. She walked the forest paths slowly, leaning on a staff, her hair now fully silver, her movements deliberate. She paused often to rest her hand on the trunks of trees that had been saplings when she first left them to their fate. Some of them towered above her now, their crowns lost in the canopy. She spoke to them softly, thanking them for teaching her what no lecture or textbook ever could. They answered in the language of rustling leaves and the quiet strength of shade. Standing in the heart of the forest, she realized she had become part of a legacy greater than herself. The experiment, once derided as folly, had become proof of possibility. The land had healed, and in its healing it had healed her too. She knew she would not live to see the full measure of what this forest would become, but that no longer saddened her. The lesson was already sown, carried in her words, in the minds of those who had heard her speak, and in the silent testimony of the trees themselves. When she finally left the park for the last time, she did so without regret. She had given her life to the cause of renewal, and the forest had given her the gift of faith restored. As the vehicle carried her away, she looked back once, not to cling to the past, but to acknowledge it. The horizon was green, not barren, alive, not silent. It was enough. Her legacy was not in the awards she had won or the speeches she had given. It was in the conviction she left behind, the truth that she had witnessed and carried, that waste can become soil, that despair can give way to hope, and that nature, if given the smallest chance, will rise again. Long after her voice was gone, the forest would remain, whispering its story to those who walked beneath its canopy. And perhaps, somewhere in the silence of future years, another young woman would stumble upon it, feel the hum of life under her feet, and understand that even the most unlikely places can be reborn. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable stories we uncover. If you enjoyed this one, check out our other videos. You won't believe what happens there. And share this video with your friends, because stories like this deserve to be heard everywhere.